Now I reckon there ain't many folks who'd believe a man's word could hold more weight than gold, especially when that word was whispered over a dying man's grave on a night when the desert wind carried more secrets than sand. But sometimes, partner, the promises we make in the dark are the only light that'll guide us through the storm that follows. This here's a tale about honor when the world's turned its back on you, about love that grows quiet in the shadows, and about a vow so sacred it could resurrect a woman's good name from the ashes of small-town gossip. So settle in close to the fire, friend, because this story's got more twists than a sidewinder's trail, and every word of it's true as the iron in a sheriff's badge. The autumn of 1887 painted Cedar Ridge, Arizona territory in shades of amber and regret. It was the kind of high desert town where everyone knew your business before you did, where gossip traveled faster than dust devils, and where a woman's reputation was more fragile than morning frost on a window pane. Miss Catherine Fairweather had been the schoolteacher for nigh on 3 years, and in all that time she'd been as steady as the North Star and twice as bright. She was a woman carved from determination and kindness, maybe 26 years old, with auburn hair that caught the schoolhouse sunlight like copper wire, and green eyes that could gentle the wildest child or stare down the most troublesome parent. The children adored her, and their letters showed more improvement than the town had seen since the railroad came through. But Catherine carried a burden heavier than her leather satchel full of school books. Her father, Thomas Fairweather, had been Cedar Ridge's doctor until consumption took him 2 winters back. On his deathbed, with the desert wind howling like a banshee through the eaves, he'd made Sheriff Jake Morrison promise something that no living soul knew about, something that would change everything when the time came to call it due. Sheriff Morrison was a man built like the mountains that ringed their valley, solid, dependable, and weathered by years of keeping the peace in a land where justice came hard-won. At 32, he'd already seen enough of life's harsh edges to know that good people were scarcer than water in August. He'd watched Catherine from afar for longer than he cared to admit, admiring the way she handled herself with quiet dignity, the way she made that little schoolhouse feel like hope itself. Jake had never been much for pretty words or courting rituals. His love for Catherine was like the deep wells the old-timers dug, hidden from sight but running truer than any river. He kept his feelings buried beneath his badge and his duty, figuring a woman like her deserved better than a man whose closest companions were a Colt 45 and a jail cell full of drunks and drifters. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with a lie dressed up in Sunday clothes. Mrs. Adelaide Thornbury was the kind of woman who measured her worth by how much misery she could spread with her tongue. She'd been after the teaching position for her own daughter, Millicent, ever since Catherine arrived, and her resentment had festered like an infected wound. When she saw Catherine walking home one evening with Johnny Brewster, the young bank clerk who'd been helping her with the schoolhouse accounts, Mrs. Thornbury's imagination conjured up a scandal where none existed. Within a day, her poison had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire through dry grass. The story grew with each telling. First, Catherine was keeping improper company. Then she was meeting men after dark. By the 3rd day, Mrs. Thornbury was whispering that the schoolmarm was nothing but a common harlot who'd been entertaining half the unmarried men in town. The truth was simpler and sadder than fiction. Johnny had been walking Catherine home because she'd been receiving threatening letters, crude, ugly things that warned her to leave town or face consequences. She'd kept them to herself, not wanting to burden anyone, but Johnny had noticed her fear and insisted on seeing her safely home each evening. The storm broke on a Thursday morning when the school board assembled like a tribunal of righteous judgment. 5 men sat behind the teacher's desk like crows on a fence post, their faces grim as January sky. Chairman Josiah Murdoch, who owned the largest ranch in the county, cleared his throat with the authority of a man who'd never doubted his own righteousness. "Miss Fairweather," he said, his voice echoing in the empty schoolhouse, "we've received disturbing reports about your conduct." Catherine stood before them straight as a ramrod, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles showed white as bone. "And what conduct might that be, Mr. Murdoch?" "Don't play coy with us, missy," snapped Harold Grimm, the banker. "Half the town's seen you carrying on with young Brewster, and Lord knows who else. This is a Christian community, and we won't have our children taught by a woman of questionable character." The accusation hit Catherine like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. "Those are lies, gentlemen. Johnny Brewster has been walking me home because I've been receiving threatening letters. I can show them to you if—" "Enough." Murdoch's fist hit the desk like a gavel. "We've heard all we need to hear. Your services are no longer required in Cedar Ridge. You have until Sunday to pack your belongings and leave town." As word of Catherine's dismissal spread, the town turned against her like a pack of wolves scenting blood. Women who'd once smiled at her crossing the street now crossed to avoid her shadow. Children who'd run to greet her after church now peeked at her from behind their mothers' skirts. The mercantile refused to serve her. The hotel clerk told her she was no longer welcome for Sunday dinner. Catherine felt the weight of their judgment crushing down on her like a cave-in. She'd lost more than her job. She'd lost her place in the world, her sense of belonging, her very identity. The woman who'd once filled the schoolhouse with laughter and learning was now a ghost haunting the edges of a town that wanted nothing more than to forget she existed. But Sheriff Morrison was watching. He'd been watching when Mrs. Thornbury started her whispering campaign, when the school board held their Star Chamber proceedings, when the whole town turned its back on the best woman they'd ever had. And with each passing hour, the weight of his father's promise pressed heavier on his conscience. Friday evening found Jake standing in his office, staring at the wanted posters on his wall without seeing them, when Deputy Sam Kowalski burst through the door like his tail was on fire. "Sheriff, you better come quick," Sam panted. "There's going to be trouble at Miss Catherine's boarding house. Buck Henley and his boys are liquored up and talking about running her out of town tonight." Buck Henley was exactly the kind of man who gave honest cowboys a bad name when sober, dangerous when drunk, and always looking for an excuse to prove his twisted idea of manhood. The thought of him and his cronies going after Catherine made Jake's blood run cold as mountain snow. "Round up whoever's sober and willing," Jake commanded, strapping on his gun belt. "And Sam, if shooting starts, you make sure Miss Catherine doesn't get caught in the crossfire." The confrontation came just after sundown, when the desert sky was painted in shades of blood and gold. Buck Henley and 3 of his drinking companions stumbled down Main Street like a pack of rabid coyotes, making enough noise to wake the dead and proclaiming their intention to clean up this town of immoral women. Jake stepped out of the shadows in front of Catherine's boarding house, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight like a star. "That's far enough, Buck." Henley swayed on his feet, his hand hovering near his gun. "Well, if it ain't our noble sheriff, protecting his fallen angel." He spat in the dirt. "Step aside, Morrison. This ain't your concern." "I'm making it my concern," Jake replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down worse than drunk cowboys. "Miss Fairweather is under my protection." "Protection?" Buck laughed, but there was no humor in it. "From what?" "The truth. Everyone knows what kind of woman she is. Hell, maybe you've been sampling her wares yourself." The words hung in the desert air like gun smoke. Jake's hand moved to his Colt, and in that moment, every man on the street knew that the next words spoken might be the last ones some of them ever heard. But before violence could erupt, the boarding house door opened, and Catherine stepped onto the porch. She was dressed for travel, her few belongings packed in a worn carpet bag, her face pale but determined. "Please," she said, her voice carrying across the space between them like a prayer. "There's been enough ugliness. I'll leave quietly. There's no need for bloodshed." "No." The word came from Jake's lips like a gunshot, sharp and final. "You're not going anywhere, Catherine." Every eye on the street turned to him, and Jake knew that this was the moment when everything would change. The promise he'd made to Thomas Fairweather 2 years ago was about to be revealed, and with it, the secret he'd carried like a stone in his heart. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his spurs jingling in the sudden silence like funeral bells. When he spoke, his voice carried across the dusty street with the weight of absolute truth. "Gentlemen," he said, looking each man in the eye, "it's time you knew something that's been kept private out of respect for the dead. 2 years ago, when Doc Fairweather was dying, he called me to his bedside and made me swear a sacred oath." Buck Henley's drunken bravado faltered. "What kind of oath?" Jake reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. "Tom Fairweather made me promise to watch over his daughter, to protect her good name, and if the time ever came when the town turned against her, to tell the truth about why he really left St. Louis." Catherine's face went white as fresh snow. "Jake, no. Father made me promise never to—" "Some promises need breaking, Catherine," Jake said gently, "and your father's dying wish was that his sacrifice shouldn't be wasted." He unfolded the letter and began to read in a voice that carried like church bells across the gathered crowd. "To whom it may concern, my daughter Catherine knows nothing of what I'm about to reveal. In St. Louis, I discovered that the city's head of sanitation was selling contaminated water to the poorest districts, causing cholera outbreaks that killed dozens of children. When I threatened to expose him, he tried to frame Catherine for improper conduct with a married man, lies that would have destroyed her reputation and any chance of her becoming a teacher. To protect her, I accepted exile to Arizona territory, letting the world believe I'd made some unnamed mistake that required us to flee. My daughter has lived with the shame of my supposed failure, never knowing that her father's honor cost her everything she'd worked for. If ever she faces false accusations again, I pray that someone will speak this truth and restore what was taken from her." The letter was signed with Dr. Thomas Fairweather's distinctive handwriting and dated just 3 days before his death. Buck Henley sobered up real quick when he realized he was facing not just the sheriff's gun, but the town's reckoning with its own conscience. The gathered crowd shifted uncomfortably, and more than one woman found suddenly urgent business elsewhere. "So you see," Jake continued, folding the letter carefully, "Miss Catherine comes from a long line of honor. Her father gave up everything to protect the innocent, and she's been carrying his secret shame ever since, never knowing it wasn't shame at all, but sacrifice." Mrs. Adelaide Thornbury, who'd been watching from across the street, found her voice. "What you saw," Jake said, turning his steady gaze on her, "was a good woman being escorted home because she was receiving threatening letters. Letters I've now investigated and traced back to someone who wanted her job badly enough to terrorize her into leaving." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a branding iron. Mrs. Thornbury's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a sickly green. Jake stepped closer to Catherine, and for the first time in 3 years, he let his feelings show in his eyes. "There's one more thing Doc Fairweather asked of me, Catherine. He said if I ever found the courage to be the man you deserved, I should tell you how I felt." Catherine's hand went to her throat, her eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. "I've loved you from afar for longer than I care to admit," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "I figured a woman like you deserved better than a man who makes his living with a gun. But your father said love isn't about deserving, it's about cherishing what's precious and protecting it with everything you've got." The desert wind stirred the dust around their feet as Jake took another step closer. "So I'm asking, Miss Catherine Fairweather, will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that some promises are worth keeping and some love is worth waiting for?" Catherine's answer came not in words, but in the way she closed the distance between them, her eyes bright with tears that caught the last light of day like diamonds. When she spoke, her voice was steady and strong. "Yes, Jake Morrison, I believe I will." The crowd began to disperse, some shamefaced, others muttering about hasty judgments and the danger of listening to gossip. Buck Henley and his boys slunk away like whipped dogs, and Mrs. Thornbury found herself suddenly very interested in the contents of her reticule. But Josiah Murdoch, the school board chairman, stepped forward with the grace of a man admitting his mistakes. Miss Fairweather, he said, his hat in his hands, I believe we may have acted in haste. If you'd consider staying, well, I think Cedar Ridge needs its teacher back. Catherine looked up at Jake, then back at Murdoch. I'll consider it, Mr. Murdoch, but this town needs to learn that a person's worth isn't measured by gossip and rumors. It's measured by their actions, their kindness, and their willingness to stand up for what's right. Now, as the years rolled on like tumbleweeds across the desert, Catherine and Jake built a life together that became the stuff of local legend. She returned to her schoolhouse, where children learned not just their letters and numbers, but the value of judging people by their character rather than the whispers of small minds. Jake continued to keep the peace, but now he had a partner who understood that justice isn't just about the law, it's about protecting the innocent and speaking truth when lies would be easier. And on quiet evenings, when the desert wind sang through the cottonwoods, they'd sit on their porch and remember Thomas Fairweather, a man whose love for his daughter had planted seeds of honor that bloomed long after his passing. You see, partner, the real treasure in this story isn't the love between Jake and Catherine, though that's precious as water in the desert. It's the understanding that our promises to protect the innocent, to stand up for truth, and to see the good in people, those promises echo through time like church bells across the prairie. Sometimes the most important vows we make are the ones nobody else witnesses, whispered in the dark to dying men, or spoken silently to our own hearts when we decide to be better than the world expects us to be. And sometimes, just sometimes, keeping those promises can restore what gossip and small-mindedness tried to destroy, reminding us all that honor isn't about being perfect. It's about doing what's right, when doing what's right comes hard. So the next time you hear whispers about a good person's character, remember Catherine Fairweather and the sheriff who loved her enough to speak the truth. Because in this old world, where rumors travel faster than righteousness, sometimes all it takes to change everything is one person willing to stand up and say, no more, that there's a lesson worth carrying. Friend, worth carrying all the way home.